Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and these two trays that you see here in front of us are what could be considered as my two oldest bins. Or really, this one right here could probably be considered in a way as my oldest worm bin. If you go by the date that's on the sticker here, March 29th, since we're in the tail end of June now, this is now in a way 85 days old. And if you go by the date that's on here, this is 75 days old, 10 days difference. And the reason I'm sort of qualifying that description is because of something that I've been struggling with here. Trying to decide if it's the right way to think about it or if I need to change the way I'm maintaining my records about these bins. So I've got some information over here on my board. I figured I would grab it and share it with you guys really quick just to explain what I'm struggling with here. I've got some information here. As I mentioned earlier, the worm bin is 85 days old if you have a certain point of view about it, and the cocoon nursery 75 days old. It's the worm bin here that I'm struggling with, because the bin was, you know, chugging along. At 60 some odd days I started noticing that things just didn't seem right, and then over time I started to suspect that the material in the bin, the casting material that the worms were inhabiting, had become overly damp and clumpy, and that there was no airflow within the material, and that it was, I guess my best diagnosis of what's been happening in some of my systems where I allowed that excessive dampness to occur was that the bin basically went anaerobic. Not enough oxygen for the worms to get by, a breeding ground for anaerobic bacteria. As worms succumb to that dangerous environment, start dying, an outbreak of mites can be observed. So I started to try to lure the worms out of that suspect material by laying in some fresh bedding, some fresh food, with the assumption that the worms can make their way out of that stuff on their own. Towards the end, I started to feel like that was not even possible anymore. So I went on sort of a rescue mission to get the last of the worms that were still moving within that tainted, clumpy material and move them into that fresh bedding. And it was 12 days ago that I did an extraction of that bad, clumpy material that I had removed all the worms from. And it's basically because all that stuff is gone now, and the worms are now basically inhabiting almost like a fresh batch of bedding, that it makes me wonder if it's realistic to consider this bin as really being this old. Is it really the oldest of my worm bins at this point, or is it really the newest of my worm bins? You know, 12 days ago when I removed the last of the old material, in a way, I've been considering it as a restart of the system, and maybe for that reason I should really start the counter over to show that, you know, starting perhaps with today's feeding, over time the system will end up being a bunch of finished casting, which is the result of X number of feedings being converted by the worms into castings. But for me to really consider this as an 85-day-old system with, I don't know how many, you know, half a dozen or so feedings that have already gone into it over that time, it's not even a realistic way to think about it anymore. So I'm really tempted to sort of relabel this thing as maybe not even as 12 days ago, perhaps a little bit earlier, dating back to that day that I had started baiting worms out of the old material. So I'm still kind of struggling with exactly how to treat this. I might end up relabeling it and restarting the counter on it and just writing off that tainted material as having ended back on day, you know, 60 or 70 something, whenever it had been kind of written off as done. And then giving this new bin sort of a new age, maybe not 12 days old, maybe whenever it was that I started actually providing the worms with new fresh bedding for them to move out into. So it's just sort of a little record-keeping question mark in my mind. How do I want to consider this? Some of you who've been following along with the story might also have, you know, your own opinions on this, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it. But I just wanted to touch on this topic since it's been kind of nagging me a little bit every time I look at my spreadsheet. But really the only objective I had here today was to possibly, taking into consideration what's going on in the other bin, possibly bringing an end to that system where I've Just been running the system for, at this point, 75 days with no adult worms left in it anymore. It's just a collection of castings, probably loaded with a bunch of cocoons. You know, allowing time for those cocoons to hatch and trying to give time for those baby worms to get rounded up. Maybe that system's ready to be called a done deal at this point. And the other system, it's ready for some food. So that's what I'm after today. Let's get these bins up on the bench and get to work. Now each time I've done this, I've always started in the nursery bin. We're going to do the same today. So I guess the reason being, you know, if for whatever reason we've come to some determination that even after 75 days there's still a whole lot of potential in this material for ongoing hatching and movement of baby worms into the collection area, then who knows, maybe I'll need to come down here with a little bit of fresh food to add into this system. I don't suspect that that will be the case. There was a couple other bits of info here. There was, you know, 25 days ago since that last feeding was applied, and over time I've added food 3 individual times into this over those 75 days. Those 75 days were broken up into 26 days of just given time, doing nothing, and then 49 days ago, 7 weeks, I initiated the migration of the worms by placing food into that edge of the bin. And then hopefully, you know, over time we've got some baby worms that have come out of their cocoons and made their way over into this edge of the bin. This side of the bin definitely looks kind of nice. It's got all kinds of nice fresh castings in it. It's the only section of the bin that was covered with plastic to allow for the moisture in there to be preserved, whereas on this side, with only the paper coverings, I've been just continuing to allow this material to just dry. And, you know, as baby worms do emerge from their cocoons, hopefully they'll find it that the material is a little bit dry and that they might prefer to find some material that's a little bit more dampened to their liking. So it'll kind of hopefully get them moving and ending up over on the edge of the bin where I'd like for all the worms to eventually collect. And, you know, I'm just looking in here. I found a fairly dark colored cocoon, and then when I dropped it I just spotted another one right next to it. Cocoons exhibit this really dark color when they're approaching that point in time when they're close to hatching, and that in itself might, for some people, be enough reason to decide that maybe this this process should just continue to allow those not dry, I'm getting ahead of myself, to allow for those dark cocoons to eventually hatch. But the dryness in this material could possibly be a reason that these cocoons have not yet hatched, because cocoons, I think, do need certain conditions to hatch, which is sort of a combination of temperature and moisture and stuff like that. And it is quite possible that over time I've allowed this material to get just dry enough to the point where those cocoons have sort of decided that they're going to remain in that cocoon stage, and no baby worms are going to be emerging from them, being that the conditions are just unfavorable for those baby worms to be able to survive and thrive. So it kind of puts their emergence from the cocoons on hold until such a time that the either the temperature becomes good again or the moisture level becomes good again. So I believe just by the fact that this stuff has become rather dry over time, it's given me the sense that quite possibly, even if there are cocoons remaining in this, that I probably shouldn't really expect to see many more of them hatching or any baby worms emerging from them. And it is kind of a shame to write them all off, because as I poke around I definitely keep spotting them, and I could just be, who knows, maybe bumping into cocoons that have already hatched. Maybe there's already kind of been a birth of baby worms there, and they've already moved out and ended up over here with the rest of their brothers and sisters. But I do have a sense that continuing to leave this material over here in this dry state with the expectation of more worms hatching out of the remaining cocoons is just something that's not really going to ever be realized. It does seem like the time has come now to call this process as complete. A little worm. Let's put him over there where he belongs. And it's probably a safe assumption that, you know, all this dry stuff over here probably has nothing in it, but perhaps some of this damp stuff that's right out here on the perimeter of the baiting area where the plastic was recirculating the moisture, maybe we'll still find a worm or two within this stuff. So I guess before we kind of write it all off as being part of the finished castings collection over on this side of the bin, we could just sort of look through it a little bit to see if we see any movement. If we do, we'll just move the baby worm over to where they belong. And then I think it is time to bring an end to this process here. I mean, you know, 75 days, certainly enough time to give cocoons the opportunity to hatch, and for those baby worms that came out of them to get mobile and find their way to sort of greener pastures, places where there's food and moisture and all the things that they need to be happy and healthy. And I'm not going to go crazy trying to maximize the collection of castings here. If some of this casting material goes with the worms to their new home, that's fine too, but I do believe that the time has come for this process to be signed off as complete and successful. And naturally, it's only successful if we look around within here and find a good number of worms, baby worms. So I've not yet done any haul outs of any of the worms over on this side of the bin, so it will be kind of interesting to see what it is that we ended up with over here over this time. And I believe that this really is probably the last of my official cocoon nursery systems. I was running a number of them, but I've recently bought all of them to a close, and now this one will be the last one. The only other one that I'm considering as a possible candidate for ongoing treatment similar to this is in my mixed bin, where I had actually hauled out the last of the worms 40 some odd days ago, and the finished castings have just been sitting in that container untouched since then. I've not even looked in there. And I just keep wondering if maybe at this point, maybe I do sort of treat that as not just a holding pen for finished castings, but maybe as something that has over time transformed into a cocoon nursery as well, or a baby worm nursery as well. So I do plan on checking in on that system one of these days just to figure out what to do with it. Do I just consider that as done castings, or what? But I digress. Let's get back to this. I'm going to get a tray that we can move all this material out into. This stuff is now done, and then once we get over into the adult bin, we'll be able to release all this material in here and try to boost up that population in that other system where we had all those worms die off. So whatever number of worms we get in here will be enhancing the existing population in that other system, which I think will be a huge benefit. So let me go get a tray, and then we'll proceed with the extraction of the worms from here. So now I do have a container here, which is pretty much the ideal size for this sort of activity. And I suppose all we're really going to do here is start extracting the entire contents of what's over here. And I mean, after 25 days since the last time I fed this, I would have to assume that there's very little, if any, food remaining in here. I would assume that the only game in town for whatever worms have congregated over here is the bedding that the system was made up out of which there's still a little bit of leftovers, but not much. It does seem like it's mainly castings at this point. And as I poke around, I do find some larger size worms in here. Ones that might have, you know, came into the collection of castings when I had sifted it. Maybe slid through the sifter, maybe they were still somewhat smaller back when this whole process began. Maybe they've grown up in here. but you can also see a good number of just little baby worms. I would have to say that the majority of the worms I'm spotting in here are somewhat smaller little worms with an occasional somewhat larger worm mixed in. And you can see there's chunks of paper, chunks of cardboard, pieces of leaves, all stuff that these night crawlers would definitely consider to be a viable food source. So I didn't leave them hungry over these past 25 days since I've not added any food. I think they've been probably just fine in here with what they've got left over. Yeah, you can see a whole bunch of leafy material in here too, which is probably one of the worm's favorites. Most times I just write it off as bedding, but I really do also need to consider it as a food source because it eventually all gets eaten, turns into castings. So it's just like all the other bedding that the worms get. It's just another food source. So it does seem like every handful I pull out does seem to have fairly large numbers of little baby worms scattered throughout it. And it's every time I do this that I feel like I don't have a lot of worms when it comes to their overall weight. But when I think of how many there are as far as their count, yeah, they're very small worms. So, you know, a whole bunch of them would be required to, you know, equate to 1 pound of worms, probably well more than 1,000. So I believe that the rough figure that most people generally go with when they try to estimate the number of worms they have relative to the weight that they, you know, relative to their weight when you measure them with a scale, is like about 1,000 worms generally equates to 1 pound. Here's a banana stem too, which I'm sure they're enjoying as well. You could see a baby worm in there. But I mean, if you wanted to measure baby worms, these little tiny worms, to see how many of them it takes to reach 1 pound, I would think you need many thousand. So there again, it's not something we can easily estimate based on weight, because the large majority of the material that I'm pulling out of here probably is castings at this point, as well as leftover bedding that they didn't really break down quite yet. But I am quite surprised at how much casting material there is in here. These little baby worms definitely have a voracious appetite, like people have mentioned in the comments of my videos. And they've definitely left a good number of castings here in the process. So, I don't know. When I did a similar extraction of the feeding area in one of these nursery bins the other day, it felt like there was a whole lot more very fresh bedding remaining in that system, which sort of clouded my ability to observe the number of worms that I was pulling out at that time. But here it feels like I'm getting a much better glimpse into how many worms actually occupy this material here. And there's got to be well over 1,000 worms here. I don't know. I'd love to hear people's ideas as far as what it is we're dealing with as far as the numbers. And it would sure be nice to think that there is 1,000 worms in here, because I've since reduced the count in the other system where I experienced the die-off and I extracted all the tainted material, and there again I'm just estimating, but I sort of reduced the estimated number of worms in that system down to about 300. And it seems kind of a shame, but if we can boost this, you know, the system's numbers back up to something over 1,000 as a result of placing all these baby worms in there, then I think we've got the makings for a good healthy bin once again, even after sort of a crash and burn situation that happened recently. So I believe that this is probably what most people would consider a success story after 75 days. I believe that this is pretty much what we're after when we take some finished compost that we would normally just, you know, use in the garden as is, and just keep it around for a little longer. Let it sit around for another 2 or 3 months. Let the cocoons within the material hatch. Let the baby worms congregate so that they could be hauled out. And then, you know, preserve those worms as part of your worm farm, as opposed to just releasing them out into the wild. Not to say that releasing them in the wild is a problem or a bad thing either, but, you know, in certain cases, especially in a case like mine where I've recently lost so many worms. It is kind of nice to suddenly see that I've got another 1,000 worms here to include in my active bin. So speaking of the active bin, let's go fetch that thing. But I believe that at this point I'm going to indicate the state of this system here as being completed using my current latest little method of just flipping the label upside down. But I'm going to go get the active worm bin that's got the adult worms in it, into which we're going to release those collected worms, and we're also going to add some food. So let's go get that one over here now. Alright, so here's my my bin that I can't seem to figure out what to do with. The up in the air bin. But I do feel like I'm continuing to lean towards the idea of sort of relabeling this as not being a bin that started at the end of March and is 85 days old. It does seem to me more realistic to think of this bin as only being a couple weeks old, which is the point in time when I had determined that the material in the bin was becoming nasty, that I had put all these leaves in here as an attempt to try to lure the worms out of the material. And, at that point you would have to assume that some worms probably did jump at that opportunity right away and made their way right over into that fresh bedding pretty quickly. And at that point, maybe that's the point in time that I need to treat as the actual launch of this system. So yeah, I went through a couple phases. I built up that side of the bin with all these leaves. I later came in and I extracted all the tainted material, picking all the worms out, moving them into the bedding, and then later I came in here, which was I believe 6 days ago, to just sort of to level all this out, to level all this material out, and I think I remember placing a whole bunch of grit in here. Even though I didn't feed, I did place a whole bunch of grit in here, because it did seem to me like, hey, if the only food they've got is a bunch of bedding, a little bit of grit to go along with it would probably be helpful to help them break down the material. So like I said, according to my record keeping, I've relabeled the population of this worm as being an estimated 300 worms. And, as I start to pick around here a little bit, we're going to start spotting some worms. And maybe this will give us a chance to sort of figure out whether that estimate is realistic. And, when it comes to food, there was this old mango seed. And that might have been the only piece of old food that I sort of salvaged out of the old material before I got rid of it. Maybe this, stem of a banana. I don't think there was a whole lot more. So I didn't really treat that as a feeding. I just treated that as the stuff that the worms were being brought over with. So in my mind, this system hasn't even really received any feedings. So I'm not sure. When we first started poking around, we did see a few worms. Over here too, I can see a number of them squirming around. So I don't know if we've observed a couple hundred yet, but we've only looked at that side of the bin. I was covering up with plastic just because of the amount of dry materials that had been placed in here, and I really wanted the plastic to prevent what little moisture there was in this bin from escaping through evaporation. And you can see the materials in here are somewhat on the dry side. So it's a good thing that I bought a good amount of material down here. I bought down this tray here full of frozen stuff. All this frozen stuff, as it starts to thaw out, it's going to kick out all that moisture content. It's going to help a lot within this system to boost moisture, because it is rather dry. And I'm wondering if the only spot where we're actually starting to observe worms is where there's still little havens of moisture pockets. But it does seem to me like an estimate of about 300 is pretty realistic for what's in here presently. So now, besides adding that food, which is quite a bit as you can see, and the baby worms that we pulled out of the nursery bin, I'm going to also go ahead and expand this living space for these worms considerably by also adding a whole bunch of additional bedding into here. And that bedding is also going in dry. So I believe for that main reason I am going to be restoring the plastic coverings onto here, at least for a little while, at least until I start to feel like the contents of the bin have, for the most part, all started to absorb the ambient moisture within there. You know, the frozen stuff will start kicking off moisture, it'll try to evaporate, the plastic will capture it, it'll return it back down into the bin, hopefully dampening some of the more dry stuff that's in here. And then at some point soon I will remove the plastic covering from the system and cover it with something that allows for a little bit more airflow. But I think you'll agree that the type of material that this bin is made up of right now does have plenty of air pockets in it. A lot of really good airflow happening in here just by nature of the type of material that it's made up of. So hopefully you'll agree that keeping the plastic on for a little while longer in this case is a smart thing to do. Especially considering all this dry stuff that I'm going to be plopping in here along with the food. That stuff too is going to suck up some of the moisture. So like I said, the restoration of the plastic covering is going to be a temporary solution until such a time that I feel comfortable with the overall moisture level within the bin, but it does seem to be a little bit on the dry side. So we're going to allow for the moisture content to sort of get shared between the dry and the damp materials. So we laid down some bedding. On top of the bedding we put in the coffee, as well as even more bedding with the coffee filter itself, right? Why don't we plop in a portion of the food that we brought in here for them. You could see end of a cucumber, some, I don't know what this is, some sort of lettuce, pieces of a banana peel, pieces of a mango peel, a chunk of a mushroom. So I really just dropped my hand down deep into my frozen food collection bag in my freezer to pull out a wide assortment of different food items to give this bin today. So along with the feeding, they're going to get grit. The grit that I use is pulverized eggshell. But like I said earlier, I'm going to go pretty generous on the bedding here. So we're even going to drop in not only the newspaper that went in on the bottom, but some shredded cardboard bits. Because it does seem like a variety of different bedding types is also a nice way to increase airflow, especially this stuff here, right? If you look at it, there's air pockets all throughout the shredded cardboard, especially when it's this corrugated type of cardboard. So I think that that's really beneficial for creating a nice airy, light environment for the worms to be in. Here's another worm favorite, chunk of banana peel. Try to sort of unwrap it a little bit, spread it out. Not that it matters all that much, but that looks to me like a pretty generous feeding. I had originally thought that I wouldn't be going that big on this feeding because I didn't even know I'd be moving an estimated 1,000 baby worms into this system. So my initial thought on putting food in here was to go light and somewhat sparing on the food to not create a sort of a glut of food in here. But I think with all the baby worms going in, I believe that it is probably a good idea to go kind of generous. So I switched gears there a little bit and I went pretty generous on the food. So now the paper covering that was on top of the nursery bin is still sitting over here on the side. I'm going to reuse that as the new paper covering here. So these old bits of paper that had been covering things up here, they're just going to go into this feeding area at this point as additional bedding for the worms, kind of covering up all this frozen stuff, in a way shielding all of the baby worms that we're going to plop in here on top a little bit from the direct contact with the frozen materials right below them. I mean, they're also still kind of occupying the material that they're in. But let's not forget about restoration of this old food item too that we encountered on the way in. And then I've even got some more bedding, a whole bunch of leaves that we're going to include here at the end. But I believe the time has come to take this stuff here, and it's a whole bunch of stuff. It includes a bunch of nice castings as well. So let's go ahead and drop it in and get these little babies reunited with all of their relatives, separated all those weeks ago. Just want to make sure I don't leave any stuck here within the container. Let's make sure we got them all. Since I know they're babies, I know that they're kind of tricky to see. I'll definitely have to take one more look at this before I call it quits. So I guess that newspaper over there is going to sort of prevent the worms from being able to dive straight down into the frozen materials. If they do want to explore the contents of the bin, they will probably have to sort of squirm off to the side if they want to make their way down into the bedding. But for now, they're probably going to remain content within the material that they were occupying up until now, so they could just stay put if they like. And all over the place, we could see a good mix of, you know, some slightly larger worms, but mainly little itsy-bitsy worms all over the place. Some of them really tiny. Look at that little guy and that little guy. So, that's pretty cool. It always feels good to put lots and lots of bedding in for some reason. I don't know why I didn't do it more frequently in the past. But I guess the leaves here were meant to be the sort of the topping layer here to help me cover up some of these unnatural pieces of processed materials such as paper and cardboard bits. I just have this sort of personal preference to encounter more natural looking materials in my worm bins when I initially open them up, so I like leaves, and I'm sure the worms like them too. And by doing this, we've really increased the overall size of this bin. A whole bunch of fresh bedding, a nice big pile of fresh food for them, a whole bunch of material that the baby worms came along with as well. So now this is actually starting to feel like a good mature bin. So like I said, plastic covering going back on, but first we're going to recycle this piece of newspaper that was covering the worm nursery and doing a great job to let moisture escape. But for now, we're not looking at airflow, because I believe we've got material that has good airflow just by its nature. For now, I think we're just looking for moisture preservation, and that's why the bubble wrap's going back on. So, mission accomplished. That's what I was after today. I'm down now one more system, one less system to require maintenance. The worm cocoon nursery is now a done deal after 75 days. And this, our 85-day, I'll put it in air quotes, the 85-day-old system, who knows, maybe by the next time you see this system, I may have recategorized it as being a much younger system. But I'd still love to hear people's thoughts on, is this something that you would consider as only a system that's only a few weeks old, or is it realistic to think that this is really coming up on 3 months old? I don't think so. I'm really swaying more towards the idea of treating this as possibly my newest bin at this point. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.